you hear me? Yes. Welcome to our session. My name is Karen Scott. I teach here at DePaul in the History and Catholic Studies departments. The title for our session this afternoon is Cross-Cultural Communion in a Postmodern World. We have two speakers. Each of them will speak, and if it's all right with you, we will leave the questions for the end. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So our first speaker is Daniel Groody from the University of Notre Dame.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to begin with a story. It's a story that happened to me about 8 years ago. And I had received news that my uncle had died, and his name was Bill Groody. And he was my godfather, and he was a beloved member of the family. And so when we heard of his passing, we went back east to Ashland, Pennsylvania, where he was from. And we had a funeral mass for him. We paid our last respects. And then we laid Bill Groody's body into the ground. When I went home after the funeral, I was very struck because when I opened my email, there was one email that just said on the message line, a note from Bill Groody. So my first reaction was, wow, he made it. And I opened it up and this person said, my name is Bill Groody and I actually live out in California. This Bill Groody I'd never met. And he said, you know, my wife went away for the weekend, and I just went out on Google, and I wanted to just find out what Groodys were out there. So he eventually found some stuff I was working on, and he said, you know, if you're ever out in this area, I live near the Napa Valley, and I'd love to get together sometime. So I said, Bill, I'm coming out in a couple weeks. I said, why don't you come down to my community's house for dinner? So you can imagine the situation in any community. I flew in late in the afternoon and they knew I was coming, but when I got there they said, will you be here for dinner? And I said, yes, you know, and I met somebody on the internet and I invited him over for dinner as well. So there was this kind of deep and appalling silence and very frozen. And people were like, wait a minute, you don't even know this guy and you invited him over for dinner? And I said, yes. I said, it's probably okay, he's probably a lost relative. Well, Bill and I started connecting the dots and we found out that we were connected through two brothers who actually migrated from Ireland through Canada into the United States. But something happened. I think one of them married outside the clan and it caused the other brother to get very angry. And so he wanted to get back at him and he wanted to make him as angry as possible. And so he actually he said, I know what I'll do. He says, I'll become Protestant. So his family went with the Protestant line and my family went with the Catholic line, and it took 200 years to get the family back together again. It was the beginning of the Fighting Irish. And he told me later that Irish Alzheimer's is that you forget everything but your grudges. But Bill and I have become great friends. We've worked on a number of projects together. But one of the things that we did about 3 years ago that was very interesting is that we participated in a study. And in this study, you can take a sample from your cheek and you can send it off to the labs. And because they've been able to map out the DNA sequence, they could look at certain markers on that DNA sequence and find out comparing this with indigenous tribes, they can actually mark out in rough contours the migration history of your family from the last 80,000 years. So Bill Groody and I did this, and it was an exact genetic match. And this actually is the story and the route of our paternal ancestors from 80,000 years ago. And it's interesting to see how science has given us a whole new way of understanding how migration is in our genes. It's in our biological genes, even it's in our national genes. We know how deeply embedded migration is into the story of the United States. And it's in our spiritual genes as well. It's interesting when we look at the scriptures, when we look at really the beginning of Genesis, especially from that 12th chapter onward, we really see that really marks the beginning of the creation of the people of God. You know, if those first 11 chapters are the creation of the big story, from that 12th chapter on, it really is about the creation of the people of God. And it begins on a migration narrative to Abraham. Leave your country, go to the land that I will show you, and you will be a blessing. And so we see from covenant to exodus to exile to return. We see this from incarnation to discipleship, to Jesus' death and resurrection, to his ascension, to the sending of the disciples to all lands. We see how the notion of migration goes through the scriptures from beginning to end. So much so that really at the very end, John, writing from Patmos in exile, has this vision of the New Jerusalem, naming what it is to be a people of God, of being a migrant people. And Vatican II reaffirms this again, that the fundamental identity of really the church is that of being a migrant in this world. So this is the journey of Abraham. This is where he would have started in Ur. These are the borders he would have crossed in his own time, in our own time. And it's interesting to see just how this kind of shapes really the biblical narrative and the Christian self-identity. A lot of my work has been trying to look at migration from a theological perspective, and I just want to kind of offer maybe 3 levels of looking at migration theologically, and then kind of offer a bit more specifically about some reflections on migration and Eucharist. But I think there's really 3 interrelated levels. Now, the first is really the pastoral level, which is seeing how the church reaches out to those on the move through material support, through legislative advocacy, through direct service, and through other kinds of outreach. And I think most of the documents of the church, most of those and even other organizations, is primarily concerned with how we respond to those who are vulnerable. And it's really, I think, the most basic and really the most important, but it's not the only level, I think, of thinking theologically about migration. The first level goes this way. The second level is just the opposite level, and it's a spiritual level. And it's much more about listening to what's going on inside people's minds and hearts. And so a lot of my work has been going to different borders in different countries and to listen to those stories of migrants that are crossing these borders and asking, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? What brings healing and what brings empowerment? If they were here today, what would they want to say? And what message would they want to communicate? So if this first level deals with sort of an outer migration, the second really deals with this inner migration, really what's going on inside the human heart. The third tries to put this together into a sort of an understanding of human identity before God. And it sort of brings these 2 levels together of seeing that migration names what it means to be human in the world. And since so much of the controversies around migration hinge on issues of economy, security, and identity, one of the things that I think this offers is just a whole way of trying to conceive oneself. Another way of really seeing oneself in the world and trying to get another bearing on really what it means to live and move in this world. So all of this together is wrapped into really what a theology of migration looks like. Now, what I'd like to do in the short time that I have is primarily focus on really migration and Eucharist. And so I really want to look at primarily the theological territory of migration. So it's kind of really part of a larger reflection on seeing what is this connection between migration and Eucharist. But what I want to do in this piece is just look at the issue of relationships. So the kind of bigger picture here is really more of a reflection on faith and justice, as well as theology of migration. And as we know, justice from a theological perspective is not just about bringing people to court, or it's not about a blindfolded woman with scales in her hands. Migration, theologically considered, is about trying to get our relationships right. And when our relationships are not right, fundamentally we're not right. And so if we see the Christian message all about the one person who did get these relationships right with God, with each other, with ourselves, and with the environment, I mean, if we see that Christ is the one who did get this relationship right, and somehow our own justification, as it connects with that one life, it really kind of puts us into begins to put us in right relationship again. So just this one aspect that I want to focus on is one aspect of the liturgy, which is that of the liturgy of the Eucharist, and particularly the Passover meal on which it's based. So I want to just argue that a big part of the challenge of migration is not just dealing with moving across geographical and political borders, but it's also moving across cognitive borders. And part of the cognitive border is sort of moving into new places of identity, new places of self-understanding, and really new places of relationship. So I'm just going to mark out 4 of these, and that is, the first is passing over from migrant to person. The second is passing over from alienation to reconciliation. The third is passing over from otherness to neighborliness. And the fourth part is passing over from nationalism to the reign of God. And all of that together are just some concluding reflections on basically conversion, communion, and solidarity. So I just want to enter this a bit more by going into the territory of spirituality, and maybe just frame it this way. When I was about 8 years old, I can remember going on a road trip with my family, and we were driving to see some relatives out on the East Coast. And I can remember we came to a rest area, and I remember I saw this pamphlet on the floor that had a very provocative title, which I never forgot. And it said, "Did you realize that you could actually miss heaven by 18 inches?" And I can remember opening it up, and I remember I don't know if it's then I wanted to study theology, but it certainly kind of left an impression on me. But I went inside, and it said that God was not just an intellectual concept to give cognitive assent to, but God was a person to encounter in the depths of one's being. And that if one cannot move these 18 inches between the head and the heart, then one would never truly know God. And actually, I've come to see that as really quite extraordinary in light of this topic, because the Native American elders said that the long migration of human life, the long journey of human life, is the migration between the head and the heart, and then back to the head again. And I might even extend that further by saying it's from the head to the heart to the gut, and then back to the head again. And I think the walls and barriers that we erect along that road are really more difficult to overcome than even those along political barriers. And so what we're really trying to do is really come into a deeper place of analysis, a different epistemology, a different way of reading the migration reality that tries to read it from the context of Concordia. He tries to read reality through the lens of the heart, but isn't vague sentimentality, but on the other hand recognizes that there's a deeper way of knowing than just linear wisdom or linear rational knowledge. And so much of this debate over migration short circuits too quickly. And so how do we get into that deeper way of reading reality in a way that we can sort of get at the depths of our relationships, if that's what this is all about? So maybe to get into that really is to look at the issue of spirituality. And so I think spirituality, most generally considered, is how we live out what we most value. So whether it's Catholic or Buddhist or agnostic or humanitarian, it somehow has to deal with this deeper terrain of the human heart. But Christian spirituality is really about something much more specific, which is about living out Christ's values. And in that sense, we know that everything that Christ did, his preaching, his ministry, his miracles, everything that he taught was really all about the kingdom of God. And as Vatican II defines it, the kingdom of God is a kingdom of truth and life, of holiness and grace, of justice, of love, and of peace. And metaphorically considered, the following of Christ, or the migration with Christ, is really about doing this journey as a pilgrim people. And so part of it is trying to see how might we consider discipleship in itself as a form of migration, and particularly as we experience it in the Eucharist. So as we get into this sort of Eucharistic territory, this territory of our relationships, territory of reconciling our relationships, it brings us into maybe just a couple foundations of this Passover meal, which is connected to passing over to a new way of imagining the issue of migration. So what I'm really wanting to do here is not just give more information about migration, but a new imagination. And a new imagination that's theologically informed, that's rooted in the Eucharist, it's rooted in the Passover meal. So I want to just do this overarching narrative, though, within a story that happened to me when I was doing some research in Morocco. So on the coast of Morocco, there are 2 small Spanish colonies. One called Ceuta and the other called Melilla, and Gioacchino knows these well. But these are actually occupied by Spain, but they're not very big. And so if you really would put something not much bigger than around the DePaul campus, I mean, it's a little bigger than DePaul, but maybe around the kind of more regional area here, you have somewhat of a set of its dimensions. So it's that area that many refugees are streaming up to, because if they get into these small Spanish colonies, if technically in Europe they can declare asylum, try to go through the hearings, and hopefully maybe even to be deported over into the mainland of Europe. And they don't have to swim across the Gibraltar Straits, where many people are dying in these oceans. They're being eaten by sharks. Sometimes even when the border patrol picks up people, they're still alive. Sometimes their eyes are still eaten out because of the incredible conditions they have to go through. So I eventually came up into this area, and I came across 3 refugees. One had come from Sudan, one had come from Somalia, and one had come from Uganda. And they spent 3 days sharing with me their stories about what they went through. The agony of leaving home and separating from the ones they loved. The going through towns where they said they were just breathing in flies because it was just so kind of intense. The hiding out in mountains, and even going 1 year and only taking 1 shower. The crossing over the Sahara Desert and going and having one's sister die in one's arms because of the extremity of the temperatures. And then going through all kinds of human rights violations. And at the end of this 3 days, they litany one thing after another about what they went through. But then at one point, the table turned and they looked at me and they said, "So what do you do?" And they knew I was a priest, but then as I began sharing that I taught theology and I taught on issues of theology and migration, which made me kind of nervous because I knew that this group had the authority of those who really suffered, and it was they who would have the authority to say whether this spoke to their lives or no. And so this was not an easy thing because, as we know, those of us who work in the academy and those who work in pastoral ministries, often it's the case that people in the grassroots don't care that we know. They just want to know that we care. We're often in the academy, people don't care that we care, they just care that we know. And so threading the needle on that kind of borderland, I think, is where this kind of theology needs to emerge from. But these were, I took their experiences very seriously. But when I said I actually work in the area of migration and theology, Emmanuel, who came from Uganda, said to me, "Migration and theology," he said, he says, "You know, some people say that the reason why we're suffering so much here in Africa is because we're descendants of Judas. And because what Judas did to Jesus, we're actually paying the consequences." He said, "What do you think of that?" And so I said, "Well, Emmanuel, here's another way to think about this." And so this is the heart of my talk, really. I said, God in Jesus Christ so loved the world that he migrated into the far and distant territory of our sinful and broken existence. And there he laid down his life on a cross so that we could be reconciled to God and migrate back to our homeland. And so what we see God doing in Jesus is trying to constantly break down those walls and barriers and borders that keep us from being in right relationship with each other. And so I said there's a couple foundations of this, and the first one certainly is the image of God, which is passing over from being a migrant to a person. It's the most basic, but when I asked migrants, what's the hardest part? One said, coming out of the Mexican border, he says, "You know, I've stowed away in baggage compartments of buses." He says, "I've crossed deserts and almost baked to death." He says, "I've gone over mountains and almost frozen to death." He says, "I've gone days without food and water." He says, "All that is difficult." He says, "But that's not the hardest part about being a migrant." He says, "The hardest part about being a migrant is when people treat you like you're a dog, like you're the lowest form of life on earth, and like you're no one to anyone." And they said, all we really want to do is become a human being. We just want to feed our families back home, and we're just looking to do work, even if no one else wants to do it. And so just becoming a human being, passing over from being just demeaned and despreciado, I think is one of the most important elements of a foundation, the theological foundation of migration. This is a film Gioacchino and I did a number of years ago, Dying to Live, and I'm not going to develop this point a bit, but I think it's very important. Actually, through one of his conferences, we came in contact with this photographer from the LA Times who followed these migrants up on this train, and he took this picture at one moment, and it really names kind of what is at the heart of the theology of migration and the Eucharist, is really those who are crucified today in history. And, you know, this is just something, one of your brothers said this, Gioacchino, Lidio Tomasi, and this has always really struck me. And it's this, it's just that for me, one of the most compelling elements of this kind of research is how people can believe amidst the most unbelievable circumstances, and how they can really praise God amidst some of the seemingly most godless of situations. What Lidio said, he says, when you see people's faith in the midst of these conditions, it's not that the church saves the immigrant, but it's the immigrant who saves the church. And so that's a really kind of important thing to underline here, is just how is God present here in a way that may not be immediately obvious, but in a way that is actually redemptive. The second foundation of really this Eucharistic theology of migration is really about passing over from alienation to reconciliation. And it's really about God passing over into our world first as a migrant. Because it's striking how in Matthew's gospel, Jesus becomes human, enters our world as a migrant. And then in a very short time gets thrust into the desert as a refugee with his family because of the policies of a crazed king. Now, I know we're here in Chicago right now, and there's, as we know, there's a church here, a very well-known kind of mega church run by a very well-respected pastor, Bill Heidel, at Willow Creek Church. And some time ago, they had a television program where they were talking about migration and theology, and they had a theologian on it. And the theologian was just saying, he says, you know, we know that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph went into Egypt, but we don't know if they actually had legal documents or not. Well, this made Heidel very nervous, so he insisted, he goes, I'm going to insist that the Holy Family went over legally with legal documents. Well, I'm going to insist just the opposite here, because when the Great Migration happened, that is when God became human and entered Mary's womb, she was already betrothed to to Joseph. And so when Jesus entered Mary's womb, if you will, she was already betrothed to Joseph. And to be found pregnant by somebody other than your betrothed spouse would really have put Mary outside the law. And if you think about that, you know, when Mary went in haste to visit Elizabeth, it wasn't because she hadn't seen her in a long time and just really wanted to catch up with her. But she knew that if she hung around Dodge too long, she could be stoned to death. That's what the law required. And so we might ask, why would God choose that moment to really do this great kind of incarnation? I mean, couldn't he have chosen a little more legally acceptable time than that? You know? Or it might have been the way, and this is everything on sort of legal issues, it tends to short circuit for so many people. Last couple of days I've just been answering these hate mail letters that I get. Most of it is around kind of legal issues. People just get sidetracked on these legal issues. They broke the law, this is that. But might this be the way where God is saying we often get the law wrong, even if it's necessary and has its value? But might it also be the beginning of the good news, because Jesus really was putting himself in solidarity with those who were outside the law. But whatever it is, we know that God's great desire, really this is the message of Catholicism, is God's desire to bring us back to unity again, after, you know, in the midst of our fragmented and broken humanity. You know, that is really the great passion of God, is to move us from alienation to reconciliation. Thirdly, we come to the mission of God, which is about passing over from otherness to neighborliness. You know, that's really the core question, is this whole question of otherness when we come to the migration issue. And my good friend Virgil Elizondo says that when Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God, he invited everybody to table. The table was the great symbol of the kingdom. In that when he invited everybody to table, he rejected rejection. But there were some people at that table who said that these people, the sinner, the tax collector, the prostitute, the Gentile, they don't belong here. So they rejected Jesus. And yet in the process, when Jesus rises from the dead, it vindicates Jesus' way as God's way. And God basically always trying, the Good Samaritan, so many other stories, it's really about trying to see our interconnectedness with each other, to move towards communion with another, to see that this is what the Eucharist is trying to make present in our midst, is this ultimate communion that we're called towards, and which we share in this intimate, interconnected bond that we have with each other. That is the mission of the church. Fourthly, is really about moving towards the vision of God, or true communion, which is really passing from nationalism to the reign of God. You know, and this is so much. I mean, again, if you just sort of look at so many arguments that are going on in this debate around migration, so much it deifies, absolutizes, glorifies the nation, really beyond every other value, which just short circuits sort of this deeper communion that we're called to. And I must admit, I love the Olympics. When the Olympics were on last month, I was glued to the set, skiing, skating, whatever it would be. But when I looked at this, you know, I mean, I actually looked at that medal count every night. and I just wanted to make sure that we were beating Russia. And there's just something, I felt a sort of sense of my identity being American. I took pride in that, and it's part of who I am. But it's not the most important part of who I am, and that there's something deeper going on in my life, and there's something deeper going on that connects me on the other side of the borders of people. And so when this Russian skater went like this, I knew that we also shared a communion, even if she comes from a different country. And so every year, down at the Mexican border, they have a Eucharistic celebration. They just had one this past week as well in Arizona. And the bishops gather from both sides, along with the community from both sides, and they have a binational Eucharist. So they actually join the altar together on both sides of the fence. And they actually celebrate one Eucharist in the midst of this very divided political reality. It's a powerful eschatological statement in the fact that amidst all these divisions that we set up, the walls and barriers that we create, the otherness and separations that we really inflict on each other, the church really stands in prayer to say we are in fact united, that this union is already being affected, and that at the end of time these walls will fall down. Because that is really, in the end of the day, when Christ comes and returns, and we will realize the fullness of what that communion is about. And to some extent, the level to which we can cross the borders and barriers that we create in this life will be revelatory of the ones we will be able to pass in the next. So I just want to kind of a few just concluding reflections. I think that brings us back to really the core of it, which is really about crossing over the life-death divide. And in a way, it's not just about what happens when we stop breathing and physically are no longer able to live, but it really is about how do we cultivate decisions of life and choices of life in the midst of our responses to issues like migration. And another way of saying it, the former High Commissioner for Refugees said that if my brother and sister comes to me in need and I deprive them, that I also become diminished at the same time. As one writer said, that I've actually deported my own soul. And I think there's just a lot there to reflect on. And so how do we cross over those divisions and exclusions as a way of realizing that communion with each other? So if we are to really look at what it means to be alien from a theological perspective, it really has nothing to do with whether we have really actual paper documents or not. It has nothing to do with politics at all. Because if we are to describe what an alien looks like, it's actually more reflective of a person who's disconnected from God, from the stranger in need, and even from themselves. They can't see that in many ways the migrant is a mirror of the human journey. Somehow not only symbolizes who we are in this world, but exposes our vulnerability in this world. And how is this also a reflection of Christ in our midst? I mean, if you look at the only criteria we have for judgment, in Matthew's Gospel we read, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, I was sick, I was in prison, I was estranged. Migrants are hungry in their homelands. They're thirsty in the deserts they cross. They're naked after being robbed at gunpoint, even down to their clothing. They're sick after having to drink their own urine in order to survive. They're imprisoned in detention centers. And if they make it here, they're treated as strangers and as aliens. And so how is Christ present there in a way that may not be immediately obvious to the eye, but when seen from the eye of the heart, actually is no less real and present and really present? And so how is this a challenge to human solidarity? How is this even a way in which this is present at the border in this binational Eucharist? And so maybe as we struggle to work towards policies, maybe we can ground it above all in a humane policy. And maybe as we really look at the Department of Homeland Security, which emphasizes so much enforcement, we can reimagine a whole other way of really what that department would look like, which isn't so much on enforcement and building walls and putting Border Patrol agents on the wall, but it really starts with issues of development and saying that the first ideal is that people stay in their homelands and that they don't have to migrate at all. But while we're also working towards that, we recognize that the true hallmark of a community shaped by the Eucharist is really one of inclusion and hospitality. And how does this recognize really our solidarity with each other? And I close with two things. I just want to close, first of all, with what Emmanuel said when I was sharing some of these thoughts. And at the end of the conversation, I wasn't sure what he was going to say. But it was really one of the most powerful moments for me as a human being, as a Christian, as a theologian, as a priest. Because when he was done speaking, he didn't actually look at me at all. he didn't say, hey, those are really great ideas, and I hope you get those published in a peer-reviewed journal article somewhere. He didn't actually say that at all. He actually just got up from his chair, and he looked straight up, and he goes, "Yay, God!" He said, "I can't believe you would do that for me." And then I realized what this is all about. And I realized that really, in the end of the day, it's just reflecting on the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says, "I have come to proclaim good news to the poor, sight to the blind, liberty to captives, and a year of favor from the Lord." So I close briefly with this video of the Eucharist at the border here, which kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of this communion and solidarity.
It's a ministry of reconciliation, of bringing peoples together, of doing everything possible to bring about a sense of unity and harmony among peoples.
This Mass is now a tradition, and it is perhaps the most important moment in which we feel our spiritual union along this border. There is only one God, un solo Padre, one Father, un solo bautismo, one baptism, un solo Redentor, one Redeemer, y la única cruz que nos salva, and the one cross that saves us. There is no symbol in reality stronger than the Eucharist to express the unity of the body of Christ. At Mass, we always ask for forgiveness. I ask God to forgive our country for not welcoming the immigrant. Pido perdón a Dios. I ask God to forgive us for those who have died crossing the border. I ask God to forgive the hunger and the thirst that the immigrants suffer and all the dangers that they find in the desert. I ask God to forgive this country for the lack of just and compassionate immigration laws. I ask God to forgive us because there are separation and division of families that result because of cruel legislation. I ask God to forgive us because of the plans to construct a wall that will be more than 700 miles long. That wall will be a symbol of the lack of the spirit of hospitality on behalf of our country. The position of the bishops of the United States is to support any effort that will enforce immigration law, as long as those strategies and those methods respect human life. Estos son nuestros deseos y esto es lo que le pedimos a Dios que nos pueda hacer como milagro. Que Dios nos bendiga, que Dios nos bendiga. Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our first speaker. I think the images and words that he shared with us have helped us move from the head to the heart and to the gut and perhaps back to the head. So thank you very much for your words and these very moving images and your experiences. Our second speaker this afternoon is Gioacchino Campese, a brother from the Scalabrini International Migration Institute and the Pontifical Urbaniana University in Rome. And so you have the floor now. For those who just walked in, we're going to wait till the end of his talk for questions for both speakers.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I want to thank Bill, Karen, and Francis for the invitation and for the wonderful hospitality that we have received here. And this is, the title of my presentation, One Does Not Live by Bread Alone, Theologies on Migration in the 21st Centuries. Of course, the first sentence that you find there comes from the Gospel of Matthew. you have recognized that, from one of the responses, the answers of Jesus to the devil who was tempting him in the desert. And here we have a picture of the protest of a group of African immigrants in Italy, and I will translate the banner. That's what you call the banner. We are not here, says the banner, just to eat and sleep. We are not here just to eat and sleep. One does not live by bread alone. I'd like to go back to what Professor Dominic Pasura was saying. We want more. That's what the migrants want. We want more because all of us want more. No, we want to live our lives as human beings, to the fullest. What I will do, this is the outline. I will say something about. I will show actually some pictures of the contexts in which I have been, in which I have worked, and these are the pictures of the realities of migration that inform and inspire my reflection. Secondly, I would like to do a kind of a simple survey of the pastoral and theological responses by the Church to migration. I already would like to say, before I go to the second point, that this survey will be incomplete. Because it won't do justice to the complexity of the experience of migration, especially the complexity that we have heard during these days. It won't do justice also to the complexity of the responses by the Church and the reality of the Church. And finally, I want to end with the idea that of the session, cross-cultural communion or convivencia. I like the Spanish word convivencia to talk about cross-cultural communion. Okay, let's start with the context. And you see here the first picture is about the U.S. Well, not really. It is about the trip toward the U.S.-Mexico border. These are the migrants who are traveling. This one of the favorite means of transportation by the migrants. Going to the from the border from Guatemala to the north of Mexico. The cargo train, La Bestia is called La Bestia, the beast. And here, some of the migrants who are crossing the border were about to start their journey, the last miles in the desert of Arizona. I think this picture was taken in the area of Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora. You can see how they are equipped, for the journey. One of the most interesting things is the water. Without water, many of them die. Those of us who have worked at the border know very well die of dehydration. Here, this is another mean to cross the border. People are look at the people here. I was in front of these guys while they were preparing. This has been done in the area also of the reservation of the Tohono O'odham, known also as Papalo. Yeah, and we were there just in front. One of my confreres was taking pictures of here the pollero. The pollero is this guy over here. Said, no, don't worry, take pictures. That's how they were, and they were going to cross. They were going to drive, I think, two or 3 hours with these guys here in the back of the car. Something, unbelievable. Anyway, before going to this picture, I would like to say something. Just to remind you again that people die. When it comes to this situation, when it comes to the borders, people die crossing the borders. Now, came to mind, the Simon. Came to mind what you were saying about the concept of sacrifice and martyrdom. How it works in terms of migrants, the experience of migrants. Well, we could say that these are the martyrs of the border, the martyrs of migration. Because until now they say that at least 6,000 people have died at the border. Yeah, even more, those who have been accounted for. This, of course, is another border. It is the border of the Mediterranean. This picture has been, I think, has been taken from one of the helicopters of the Italian police, Coast Guard, to say that. And these are the rundown boats that migrants take to get from the coast of Africa, northern Africa, to Italy. And we have heard in the news, I think we have heard in the news what happens to many of these boats. I think it was in October, November this year, that one of them took fire, capsized, and more than 300 people just died just in, in a few hours. More than 300 people. Here, the toll of deaths, according to some, especially to a journalist, who is an Italian freelancer. He has a blog that is called Fortress Europe. I don't know if you have heard about it. And it is in different languages. He calculates that since, I think, the beginning of the 90s or the end of the 80s, more than 20,000 people have died, coming from Africa to Europe. More than 20,000 people. The martyrs of migration. Yeah, that's another. They come to Italy. This is another experience. They come to Italy. What do they do in Italy? Some of them, especially some of the African, they become farm workers, and of course they are exploited. As it happens also here in the USA. It's not something something new also to this country. They pick tomatoes or oranges. They work in the especially in southern Italy, but also in northern Italy. So these pictures have been taken in the area of Foggia and southern Italy. Here are some of the camps that have been erected by the Italian government to give a place to stay, to give a shelter to these migrants. This is a camp that is run by the Italian government. Of course, it is the church that pays for the electricity. It is the local diocese. Here we are in Calabria, which is a region, a very special region in Italy, because it is basically, some of the areas in Calabria are run by the worst and most powerful criminal organization in Italy, which is called Ndrangheta. It's kind of mafia. It's the mafia from Calabria. So you see this tent. And then close to this, here you see, of course, the camp, that has been erected and prepared by the government, and next to it there is the kind of a makeshift camp. Why? Because there is not enough place in the one erected by the government. So what do? They make up their own, their own huts from cardboard, plastic, whatever, and they do it close to next to the government camp, because in the government camp there is electricity, there is drinking water, etc. There are the different services, so they could take advantage. And these are the conditions. We are staying in Calabria. These are the kinds of huts, where these migrants who go here, in this case in Calabria, they go to pick oranges. Really miserable conditions, when you go here. This picture instead has been taken in Foggia, always southern Italy. These are people that mostly work picking tomatoes. But you see that more or less the type of settlements are just the same. They're just the same. And they just, they are erected in the middle of nowhere by them. And I'll show you. I think there is another one. No. And one of the things, there are lots of problems in these camps. Yeah, of course, there are people coming from different nations, especially African, sub-Saharan African, who live in those camps, especially from Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, etc. Mostly Francophone Africans. But together, since they are really at the margins, they are really way out of the towns there, even little or big towns. They are really in the middle of the agricultural fields. There are also other problems like drug trafficking, prostitution, etc. Another aspect of the experience of migrants, of course, is we have been insisting that the whole, during these days about this, has been the centrality of popular religion, the centrality of popular Catholicism, the centrality of the devotions of the migrants. And here this is the procession of the El Señor de los Milagros, our Lord of the Miracles, from Peru. That starts from Trastevere in Rome and goes to the St. Peter's Square. Here, this is St. Peter's Square. And this is another aspect of the life of migrants. Of course, many Latin American migrants in Italy work as domestic helpers. And here is the future of Italy. This is the future. These little kids, these are the new Italians. Something that when I went back to Italy in 2005, it was already a long time that I had been out of the country for, I think, about 17 years. But I didn't think that the country was changing so much. This is the thing that I have to say about these kids, that come from, they are children of migrants that come from all over the world. They have a problem because in Italy, the citizenship doesn't work in the same way as it works here. You have the jus soli, means that if you are born here, you are automatically a citizen. There we have the jus sanguinis, so you have to be a child of an Italian, of somebody of Italian descent in order to become a citizen. So these kids have to reach the age of 18 years old in order to apply for citizenship. Until 18 years old, they don't know who they are. I mean, they don't know to which country they belong. And this is some of the aspects of the experience of migration in Italy, also, at the U.S.-Mexico border. Okay, the responses of the church, and also the pastoral response and the theological responses. In the title of our session, we say we have seen, communion, cross-cultural communion. Communion, I say, well, there is not just communion as a response to. There is also hostility. I think again, Dominic, you were talking about that hostility. People feel chased away from some parishes. I have heard this. I have heard this thing here in the USA, in California, here in Chicago. I have heard that people have gone to some churches, and when they have said, I am from, the pastor said, well, this is not your church. You have to go somewhere else. Even in charity outreach, I was told a story from a confrere who lives here and lives and works in the USA since already, I think, he has come here 30 years ago, and he's working with the migrants, since especially Latino migrants, and he had just become a few years ago. He had just become the director of Hispanic ministry in a parish. So he has come to know that there is outreach, Christian outreach for the poor in the parish. So he goes with a family of undocumented migrants, presents himself, a young father, So and so, could you help? Oh yeah, of course we will help them. So where are your documents? Well, we have no documents, so we cannot help you. He goes next time with a family of migrants with documents. So they say, oh yeah, again you, Father, yes, could you help, these people? And what are your documents? Yeah, they are residents here in the USA. You are not citizens, we cannot help you. Next time, when there was the following meeting of the pastoral council, this confrere of mine has told me, he has confronted the pastor. He said, you say that this is Christian outreach. You should erase Christian there, because this is a fraud. That Christian there is a fraud. They got well, they get their discussion, etc. But finally they closed that kind of outreach in that parish. Theological hostility, then you should know something about that. I don't know if you've done some research about that. I discovered a couple of years ago, this article written by an ordained Catholic priest. This is in the Center for Immigration Studies. You can find it online, which is a harsh critique, of the Strangers No Longer, the pastoral letter of the bishops on migration, and especially the theology of the person who has spoken before me. This guy over there, Dan Groody. I mean, did you discover something about this guy?
Yeah, he's written me some. He's written me some nice letters.
Yeah, okay. But I invite you to read this article. I won't say, but certainly it is hostile toward that kind of theology of migration that Dan just presented to us. Dominic, if you are just out of curiosity, go and check it out. Here we have, in my opinion, maybe our greatest ally. For those who work with migrants, we have our greatest ally now. Pope Francis is our greatest ally now, because he's got it. When you realize that the first trip outside Rome was to Lampedusa, this tiny island, insignificant island in between Sicily and the African coast. Why should he go there? He went there because he cares for migrants. He cares for migrants. So, and it was interesting, the whole thing. During the celebration, the altar was a small how do you say, boat, sorry, which was made from the wood of the boats from which that carried the migrants and that brought the migrants to Lampedusa. Even the cross, the chalice also, it was something. For us who work with migrants, it was a greatest moment. But what does it tell us regarding migration in that trip, Pope Francis? Communion, no communion, indifference. What did he speak about, Pope Francis there? The globalization of indifference. People die and we do not feel responsible. Who cares? They can. And I say, how much pastoral indifference we've encountered, in our experience, in our lives, in dioceses, parishes, toward migrants. How much pastoral? And I say also that there is one of my points also in some of my articles on the theology of migration, that there is still lots of theological indifference of migration, even if we are doing a better job now. The theologians are doing a better job in this field, but there is still lots of of theological indifference, which is also due, in my opinion, it is the result also of the Western theological paternalism. Well, it is clear. Let me say what I think Italian theology. Italian theology, doesn't care about, in general, doesn't care about what is written even in the USA, or in Latin America, or in Asia, or in Africa. Doesn't care much about that. The masters, and the teachers that are taken into consideration come from France and from Germany. So, but then I reflect, these are Latin America, Asia, Africa, are the countries where our immigrants come from. And communion, and I use the word not communion but charity, not that charity in the sense of giving things. That's I use it in this maybe not in the maybe the most in the rightest word, but way. And here again, we see these African immigrants who say, we don't need just a place to sleep. We don't need just food. We want more. We want more. We are human beings like you. And so what happens? Of course, Catholic charities offer food, clothing, medical assistance, shelter, etc. But the risk is to offer things from a position of superiority. You're just giving things. You're not, and I get ahead of my argument, you're not establishing a relationship with the migrants. You're not with them. You're giving something to them. Again, charity. Migrants do not need just a house. They need a home. They need a community. Here there is, yeah. They need a home. They need a community. They need a place where they can express themselves to the fullest as human beings, as believers. Yeah. Migrants need to give and not just to receive. They feel poor, not just because they are poor, but because they are not given the chance, the opportunity to give something. And another reflection that I make is to be an immigrant, unfortunately, is a negative label. It has become, even the same immigrants, I have heard some people there in Europe, so, I have been here for the last 20, 25 years, 30 years. How long do I have to live here in order to be considered, one of, a citizen, one who belongs to this country? I will be, perpetual migrants. How does it work? Communion, another, response of the church, and yes, but with our own. And so, of course, but I don't want to just, completely criticize or totally criticize the work of the national or the personal parishes. And now I was hearing I was listening during this day about the return, of national and personal parishes, especially in the Asian experience. But they have some risks. Yeah. And we have seen that. But when I was speaking about the rejection that the migrants felt, I was speaking about an Italian national, so-called national parish, in which to which a migrant, a Mexican migrant Mexican mother with her child went to register the child to catechism. And the answer was, no, this is not your church. This is the Italian church. the risk is hostility, discrimination, exclusion. We have heard also today in the presentation by JC what kind of exclusion, just because you belong to a different ethnic group, you are out of the sacrament, you're excluded by the sacraments. Yeah, I mean, the ethnic mission or centers. I am not saying that these structures are not valid, but I am saying that there are always risks, there are always dangers. Then, of course, we can discuss about even ethnic theology, so local theology, call them whatever. I have to say, in truth, that I have learned a lot from, and I have read a lot about, Hispanic theologies, Asian American theologies, etc. But, by the end, this has been said also by one of the Asian American theologian, Anselmi. The discourse about God is not a tribal discourse, and the Christian God is not a tribal God. So again, I am just pointing out some of the risks and the dangers of ethnic theology if there is no communication, if there is not mutual relationships, as Bob Schreiter was telling us yesterday. Catholicism has mutual relationships. Are we asking the right question? Because normally we ask, what can we do? We see the migrants, what can we do? We want to help them. But it's not, I have discovered, little by little, in my experience, especially the experience at the border, reflecting years after my 7 years at the Casa del Migrante in Tijuana, I have little by little I have discovered it's not about doing it; it is about being. It is the first question that we should ask. What do we do? But who do we want to be as a church? Yeah. Thank you. And this question should be asked from the borders. That's what the Pope is asking us, from Lampedusa. Here I am mentioning a Swedish writer who says, the center of Europe is Lampedusa, because what we do there shows that we'll be the Europe of the future. Who are we? Who do we want to be? Here in the USA, from Nogales or Dallas, Arizona. Is that the right question? Communion convivencia. I read it in terms of convivencia. Does our imagination of the Catholic community embrace the whole and all citizens, residents, undocumented? What is our imagination? How do we imagine the body of Christ that is the church, the faith community? And here I go to some of the keywords that are used by some of the theologians who are reflecting on migration. Kinship across borders, Christine Hager. Connectedness, Gerrit North, he is from Holland. Neighborliness, Mary Jolet from Canada. Witness as witness, Gemma Cruz from the Philippines but in Australia. Reciprocal hospitality is a pastor from Italy. From hospitality to homecoming, Matovina, him. And then I used in an article the idea of cross-cultural and cross-religious friendship as a mission to say that this should be, the way we should deal with migrants. My time is almost up, so communion. I see it as convivencia in mission. Here I am using the communion in mission definition of the church that I have heard many times from Steve parents at CTU. Convivencia is not primarily about sharing things, but about sharing in a context of equality our diverse ways of living, celebrating, thinking, caring, praying, struggling for the rights of migrants. Convivencia is to be perpetually open to the novelty and gifts of the newcomers. But ours is a pilgrim. We go back to the pilgrim people of God, a pilgrim convivencia that grows as we journey toward the rain. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Gioacchino Campese, for your wonderful talk that stimulates our imagination and our thinking about what church is, what communion is. So I think there is time for you to pose some questions of our two speakers. Yes?
I'd like to
Yeah, the lights are very bright.
I have a two-pronged question. I spent 7 months this last year in Italy. One is with the Lampedusa, it seems like a lot of people, a lot of Italians get very upset because they consider this an Italian problem. So one, I'd like to know what you think about the fact that really this should be an issue for the European Union to help. And two, in a Catholic country kind of like Italy, how do you feel about the fact that there's a law that if you help someone who's drowning, then you go to jail because you're helping someone illegally come into the country? And the third thing I'll say is what I thought was interesting is on October 12th, when they had the big march from Trastevere for the Holocaust. One of the big things that the mayor was saying is that in Rome that he was going to help a lot of people from these places, and he said maybe we could take 100 people from Lampedusa. And of course the head of the Jewish Federation said, well, you know, when we had the problem between Russia and Israel, bringing people from Russia and Israel, we were able to take, you know, just thousands and thousands and thousands, so taking 100 is not much. But I'm particularly concerned about that Italy has a law right now that if you help someone, you go to jail.
Does it work? Yes. Can you have? Yes. Now you can hear. Yes, I think there is still this law, but from what I know, especially in the island of Lampedusa, fishermen still help the migrants, and also elsewhere, especially people from the church. Church people have been really, helping a lot of migrants coming, you know, especially as asylum seekers coming from the island. They're coming, you know, also arriving in other places there in the Italian coast. So yes, I don't know. In Rome, I think that there has been a change of mayor, and it looks like the mayor is more interested in social issues. It looks like he wants to help the most vulnerable people there in Rome. But there is also a question of money, budget in these big cities in Italy. And we are going through a really, really bad economic crisis. What was the first question?
Well, the first thing I said is really, this has been considered like when everyone's coming to Lampedusa, a lot of times been upset and called an Italian.
Yes.
European, I see it as more or less, why isn't it you're part of the European Union? This is
And you see, the problem there is, yes, it is a European problem. But at the same time, when you look at the numbers of people arriving in Germany and in France, in Spain, and in other countries, they receive more people than Italy. So the other countries say, you know, you do your part. Don't just complain. You have to do your part. But it is true also that the arrival of people in Lampedusa and other parts of Italy, but anywhere in Europe, if we have a European community, there should be a European issue. Yeah. But there is also a political question. During the time of the last Berlusconi, oh my God, Berlusconi government, and there was within, you know, governing the country was the Lega, which is the most anti-immigrant party there in Italy. So he could not really. He had to say that was a European issue, just to defend the fact that they were doing nothing. Actually, they were causing disasters. Yeah, in terms of to the point that the island of Lampedusa had you know, big problems.
Other questions?
move this up here so it's easier for people to get to. I have a question about national parishes that I want to address to both of you. Just get you to talk about it a little bit. I teach a course here at DePaul, a Discover Chicago course called Global Catholicism, the Story in Stone. And we spend the first week going around to national parishes in Chicago. So we go to the Polish Mother Church, St. Stanislaus Kostka. We go to the St. Therese, which used to be an Italian church, and now it's a Chinese Catholic church. And we go to an African American church and an Irish church and so on. And tell the history of immigrants in Chicago. And in one sense, I mean, it just seems like it's a really ambivalent sort of project. In the one sense, you get these people coming thousands of miles and coming to a place that looks like home and where they're going to be taken in and they have all of these bonds of communion that they had elsewhere, and it really kind of helps people to find a place. And on the other hand, you know, my dad grew up in Chicago, and you know, he's Irish and Polish, and if you wandered into an Italian neighborhood, you'd get beat up. I mean, the kind of the exclusion that goes on because of these national parishes was oftentimes really marked. You know, people that were not of the ethnicity didn't feel welcome there. And I'm just wondering if you could both kind of reflect on the pros and the cons of these kinds of parishes, and if you have better models to suggest.
My first parish that I went to was actually two parishes together. One was a Hispanic Hungarian parish, the other one was a Polish parish. And the Polish arrived 20 minutes before Mass started. The Hungarians arrived 10 minutes before Mass started. Generally, the Hispanics arrived 5 to 10 minutes after the Mass started. But after the final blessing, you could close down the Polish parish within a minute and a half. The Hungarian, they hung around about 10 minutes. 45 minutes after Mass, the Hispanics were still around. Two very different modalities. The first criteria of the homily in the Polish parish was how short it was. And if you were under 10 minutes in the Hispanic parish, you wondered what was wrong. And so there's the multicultural parish and also the ethnic parishes. Some of the parishes in South Bend, you may know, there is an Irish parish and a Polish parish literally right across the street from each other, about the size of Sacred Heart Basilica. I mean, they're just enormous parishes. And so, to me, I guess over time, it was a lot of tensions. The biggest fear for the Polish community was that we were going to give everything to the Hispanics. And trying to kind of work within the culture and the enculturation issues, but also emphasize the universality at the same time with Catholicism. I think we're always in tension. So the particularity and the universality, for me, were always in tension with each other. And it was different depending on the community that we were with. You know, so I think for the Polish community, we wanted to expand it out to see that yes, God's community does include the Latino. For Latinos, there were ways in which, you know, I think he was trying to kind of even enculturate a bit more as well. So I don't know. I just spent a lot of time, you know, unlearning a lot of things when I remember in those parishes. But for me, I saw that value in the particularity, but lived too long and became very exclusive.
I agree. I think that when people come here from a different country and they don't know the language, they need a place to be able to celebrate in their own language and with their own gestures, etc., rituals. But how long does it last? How long does it have to last? That should be, I think, that's my question. I have no answer there. Then now they are talking about these shared parishes. I know that there is a book by this, what's his name? Yeah. Shared. I mean, with where there are different, but even those parishes, there are ethnic groups that run just parallel lives, or they interact with each other. That's when they talk about intercultural church. I always have the temptation to ask, please, could you show me an intercultural church? Could you show that to me, please? Bring me there and see how this works.
It strikes me also that after a generation or two, the ethnic church, say in the United States, is going to be very, very different from that ethnic church back home. And when people go back after a generation or two, back to Poland or back to Ireland or back to Mexico, after 2 or 3 generations, say in the United States, they're shocked and surprised to see that it has evolved. That, I mean, culture is always evolving everywhere. And in an international church like ours, inevitably, there's always perhaps an experience of alienation, of not being quite in with the culture, not being a sort of a rub with at least some people in the community. And I wonder if that isn't also a way in which we are called to grow and mature and spiritually, learn to love. That there were always going to be in our communities a very wide variety of people.
I was just thinking, you have to learn to appreciate each other. Usually in an Italian parish, people will celebrate the Mass in a certain way. But if they see something like, what was happening in the video that Dominic showed us, they would be like, can we appreciate each other, How can we interact? How can we appreciate, the different ways of celebrating, of expressing our faith, which is the same faith at the end.
So, other questions from the audience? Then please join me in thanking our 2 speakers for their wonderful talks.